Hello and welcome back to yet another GCSE prediction lesson. Now today we're going to be looking at power and conflict and what could be our predictions on terms of what's going to come up in the upcoming exams. Now of course I've got Mr. Salles joining me, and we will begin by firstly looking at all the past paper questions that came up between 2017 to 2022 and look, based on what's come up, are there any trends that could influence our predictions and what maybe AQA might be thinking about in terms of perhaps questions and poems that have come up too many times, but equally what maybe hasn't come up, okay? So, starting with 2017, students were asked to look at Bennett Charge as the main poem, comparing it to another poem, but also discussing how the effects of war are depicted. Now, when approaching this question, what would you talk about?
Oh, wow. So, an interesting thing about the poetry comparison question is you don't have to deal with both poems equally. So my tactic is to think, which poems are going to give me highest value in the mark scheme? Those are the ones that have got an interesting structure and form. They're always the ones written before 1919.
Okay.
So my revision tactic is, right, which pre-1919 poems can I link to the themes that I think might come up? And so I would already have prepared my favourite war poem written before 1919, so either Exposure or Charles Light Brigade would be my choice there.
Okay, now for 2018, Ozymandias was the question or the poem that came up, and the question was to do with ideas about power. So power, there's an overlap with war, but also it stands as its own theme.
Yeah, so I love the power theme because it's how people control each other, and that fits all the poems that aren't about war, actually. And again, exactly the same tactic. Luckily, the examiner agreed with me. That's the pre-1919 one about power. My favourite one for that is also My Last Duchess.
Okay. Now, in 2019, the poem that came up was War Photographer, and the question was how people are affected by war. So actually, war came up twice now.
Yeah, so how would you answer that one?
In terms of war in this case, I think War Photographer discusses war from a modern perspective, and what I would consider is how war is presented when considering another modern poem like Remains, okay? So the effects of war, PTSD, how war is shown to be traumatizing, but equally how war is, and the loss of foreign lives is treated in a very different way to the loss of, say, British lives. And obviously this is conveyed in both War Photographer and Remains. How about yourself?
That's a really good one. I do love that comparison, but because I'm sticking to my principle of a pre-1900 one, I'm going to go with Charge of the Light Brigade, which is about how you portray war as propaganda. And there's a really interesting discussion to be had about whether Tennyson is forced into portraying the British as heroes, but actually underneath it he thinks that the generals have genuinely blundered and there should be an inquiry about it. And that leads into the fact that this war photographer works for a newspaper, and we can argue at the end there's this real struggle with his conscience, like what difference am I making by publishing these pictures when people might just forget about them and let the wars continue.
Okay, now in 2020, Remains was the main poem that students had to write about, and the question was to do with how difficult experiences are presented. So this is actually a really interesting question in terms of, it's actually quite broad, doesn't really touch on a theme.
Yeah.
So what could people talk about?
That was a gift, wasn't it? Because all the war poems are also difficult experiences. So you could literally choose any poem. You just choose your favourite. And again, if you've prepared what you want to write about your favourites, you'd only need a third of your answer on Remains, as long as you were comparing to the one that you'd prepared. So this is an exam which is kind of legal cheating for me. You go in and you've already prepared like 2/3 of your marks. I love it.
Okay, now in 2021, London was chosen by William Blake, and the question was to do with power and control. Okay, so again, power came up as a theme, but equally control. Now, of course, it seems to be quite a popular theme from AQA.
Yeah, this would probably be my tip for what's coming up this year, a similar question about power and control rather than war. I'm so excited again. Look, you've got London as the named poem. So guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to prepare what I want to write about London, because that's not going to be the named poem this year. And I can do 2/3 of my answer on it if it is a power and control question.
Okay, now last year students had to answer a question based on bayonet charge. This is the only poem that's come up twice now. And the question was focused to do with conflict, which, to be honest, is just the other side of the coin when you're thinking about war.
Yeah.
If you think about war or conflict, you're basically talking about similar ideas and
Yes.
similar themes, right?
Yeah. So, are you predicting another conflict question or another power question?
I actually am predicting a nature question. So perhaps maybe tying it into power.
Yeah.
So perhaps power of nature, but I think nature is a theme that hasn't come up at all based on all of these questions. I think a good, interesting nature question where the power of nature is conveyed is exposure. And I personally want to make the bold statement that power of nature, or how nature is presented, will be the question that comes up. And I think perhaps exposure could be the main poem that comes up.
And what would you choose to compare with exposure then?
Oh, that's a good question. Now, in terms of how the power of nature is presented in exposure, I would suggest students go for a really easy comparison, talking about how the power of nature in Ozymandias, in toppling the statue and making those cross comparisons between Ozymandias, which illustrates the power of nature in destroying even human creation, showing us that even nature is more powerful than human beings, and cross comparing that to exposure. So there's lots of similarities that can be drawn here. And equally, when you're considering how power of nature is shown in a really, nature is presented in a very ugly and dark way, right? So both poems kind of illustrate nature, but from a very negative perspective. So I think that would be a really great comparison to make if the power of nature or even just nature came up as a key question.
So I would probably choose Storm on the Island there because of the semantic field of war,
Okay.
which would fit really easily with exposure.
Okay.
So that would be an easier comparison. Although I do love using the pre-20th century because obviously it's a sonnet, and so you've got lots of interesting things to say about structure and
The
form.
use of irony too.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So, and that's the key thing actually, is it almost doesn't matter what you compare it to, you'll be able to make it fit in the exam.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, guys, for listening.
Ready? If you found that useful, you are going to want to know what we are predicting for an Inspector Calls, and you can check that out now on First Rate Tutors channel. Go on, check it out.